All right, so if you are following along, find your way to the book of Acts in the New Testament, and we'll be looking at Acts 27. So I want to tell you what we need to know about this passage in the book of Acts. So here's what's going on here. Paul is headed for Rome. He's headed for Rome. And you might say, so what? Well, I don't think you would have noticed this. I had never seen it until I studied it extensively this weekend. I'm going to give you a quick Q&A here, and I think you'll probably get these all right. At least, some of you will know these. Who's the author of the book of Acts? Go ahead and say it. Okay, good. It's Luke. Now, this one's pretty easy. Let's see how you do. He wrote another book in the New Testament. And what is that book called? Not Habakkuk, Adam. It's Luke, actually. And, since we have a kind of a theme here, one more, maybe you'll get this one. What was the first name of Darth Vader's son? Okay, everything's Luke today. It's a Luke day. Okay. Now, let me tell you something about Luke's two books. In the gospel that bears his name, the Gospel of Luke, I learned this week, 40% of the book of Luke recounts the story of Jesus' journey from Galilee to Jerusalem, where he'll meet his destiny. That's a lot of it, right? Obviously, that's the main point of the story, but a lot of that book, 40%. In the book of Acts, 33% of the book describes Paul's journey from Jerusalem to Rome. And so it's called this journey motif, that they're both recounting the journey of two very important people, obviously Jesus to Jerusalem and Paul to Rome. Because Luke wants us to know that like Jesus, Paul had a mission. And that, Jesus' mission, of course, culminated in Jerusalem and Paul's in Rome. Now, here's what Jesus had said to Paul when he appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And Adam talked about this last week and quoted this passage. But I'd like to put it up there because it's relevant to today's message when he's going to end up really heading toward Rome. So this is Acts 26, verses 15 through 18. As you know, the Lord appears in a light, a blinding light, and Paul says, "Who are you, Lord?" "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," the Lord replied. "Now get up and stand on your feet. I have appeared to you to appoint you as a servant and as a witness to what you've seen and will see of me. I will rescue you from your own people and from the Gentiles." And then he tells the purpose of it. "I am sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light, from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." So let me just make this personal for you. The risen Lord Jesus sent Paul for you. He sent Paul for you. And he sent Paul to open your eyes spiritually, to turn you from spiritual darkness to spiritual light, to turn you from the power of Satan to the power of God, all that so that you could be forgiven and have a place among God's people who are being made pure. That's why Jesus sent Paul. That was his mission, and Paul's words are still doing that in lives today. I'm going to make a side comment about this. We are living, I think you probably would agree, in a uniquely divided moment in American history. Would you say that? I mean, it feels very, very divided, doesn't it? Now, I say that, and it is very, very divided, but I'm kind of a history buff reader, and as I read history, this has been going on like forever. I was reading a book because we had a chance to visit the Florida Keys a few weeks ago, and so I read a book about, it's called The Storm of the Century, the 1935 hurricane in the Florida Keys. And, it was a storm, it was actually the most strong hurricane to ever strike the United States in 1935 on Memorial Day weekend. And it killed, among other people, a lot of World War I veterans, because what had happened was the Roosevelt administration, these guys were called bonus marchers because they wanted their bonus after World War I, and so 20,000 of them marched on Washington, D.C., and Roosevelt and his people said, we got to get these guys out of here. And so what they did was they said, we're going to put them on the WPA projects, and one of them was in the Florida Keys to build an overland railroad down there. Actually, it wasn't a railroad, it was a road. The railroad had already been built by Flagler. And so they send them down to the Keys, and these guys aren't brought out in time, so hundreds of them die in the course of this hurricane because they weren't evacuated in time. And that became a national scandal, and it was put at Roosevelt's feet. And when you read, because the last part of the book is the clamor in Congress between the Republicans and the Democrats trying to get out of or assign blame, you think, this is as old as this was going on then, too. trying to escape blame, trying to assign blame. So I want to say, yes, it's uniquely divided, but it's been going on forever. Now, the division today still seems very strong and very far-reaching, but I don't want to be any part of being a divider. Are you with me? I don't want to be a divider. I love my neighbor. I love my neighbor who's a person of color. I love my neighbor who's in another political party. Now, let me show you what I mean here. I'm going to get a prop here, and if you've been around here, you know I love to work with Velcro and foam core. And so this thing has been around for a long time, and it's resurfacing at least once more, and so I will be using this. So I want to show you, easy, buddy. You worked in rehearsal. You stay there. Okay, so I want to talk to you about some of my priorities. Yeah, it's funny to you. Okay, so let me talk about some of... Is it good? Okay. Let's talk about some of my priorities. You're probably not going to be surprised. I'm going to say, I love God. Okay? So let's just put that one at the top here. That's a top priority for me. Now let me put one that's down the list a little bit. I vote could be an R, could be a D, could be an I, could be a G. I don't know what. You figured out. This one's a little less important. I'll write it and show it to you. Okay. I hate liver. Now, let me just ask, and I know there's some of you, no shame in it. How many of you like liver? It's a minority, but some of you do. It's a minority. Now, let me just point something out to you. Have you ever divided with someone over whether you like liver or not? Like, I can't hang with you because you like liver. You've never thought, that's it, I'm done with him, I'm done with you because you like liver. Yeah, there's an inside joke over here. We'll let it go. And that's because it's not that important. It's not at the top, right? So what happens is, I think what we end up doing is saying, well, when we start to divide, I'll put it this way. When we start to divide over how we vote, you know what we're doing? We're saying, that's more important. Because I could sit around a table with people on Wednesday night who have different color, may have different political persuasions, but our most important thing is we love God and we love these kids. So this is down the list. So we would never divide over that. It's not our most important thing. Just like we would never divide over something as trivial as liver. Now, I'm not saying that's trivial, but it's more trivial than this. Oh my gosh, it's going down, folks. It's going down. And I want to tell you this because I don't know if you know this, but there's another election coming up, right? It's not that far off. And many of our churches are divided and probably will divide again over whether we should support a particular candidate, how we support a particular candidate. And when we do that, we're putting our allegiance to our political party above our allegiance to Jesus, because if this is our core identity, then it may matter, but it doesn't matter enough to divide because we're one on the thing that's most important. Amen? Come on, give it to me. Give it up for that. That is true. That is true. Now, what happens on this voyage? Well, again, I wouldn't have known this. Guess who the most seasoned traveler is on this boat? Luke, thank you. That's the answer today. It's Luke. Actually, Luke was on it. But the most seasoned traveler on this boat, what's the second guess? It was Paul. You know that because that's the only other name you know. So I'm giving you, that was a slow ball, but I'm glad you hit it. One of the commentators who'd done a study on this said that Paul had been on 11 previous sea voyages, and someone totaled it up. It was like 3,500 miles total. So he knew a thing or two about perilous sailing. And he's being shipped off to Rome from Caesarea. And I don't have a laser pointer here, but put up the map if you would. This is a primitive map, but it gives you an idea. And so Asia, that would be modern, let me get it right, Turkey, and the Macedonia as marked there is modern Greece. And so there's Caesarea down on the far lower right, and he's going up and he's landing and he's going to make all these stops along the way as he's headed to Italy and then Rome, okay? So that is his trip. You can take that down now. Now let's go ahead and see what the passage says. And if you're reading along, we're in Acts 27, as I said, and we're going to take a look first at verses 9 through 13. Okay, 9 through 13. Now remember, he had told them, well, you may not know this, he told them not to go. And he tells them that here. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So that was probably in September, so it's in the fall. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. Okay, so they get into what's called a northeaster, and the ship is overcome by weather. And Paul, this prisoner who's being remanded to Rome to appeal to Caesar, he starts offering this advice. And I'm sure they're thinking, who are you and why should we listen to you? Now, it is a ship with 275 other men on board, and so it's a large group of people. And as the storm gets worse and worse, they start throwing things overboard. They're trying to shore up the boat in various ways. People who understand this, they may have been passing ropes under the boat, or they may have actually connected the rear to the front so that the backbone of the boat wouldn't be broken in the storm. And what I want to do today, and we're going to take a look at this in terms of the application implications of it, I want to look at Paul's 3 interventions once the storm hits. And so, if you're following along, we're going to look at his first intervention, which is this one. Keep up your courage. This is verses 21 through 26. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up and said, I told you so. He kind of did. He said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Well, he says, last night you see an angel of the Lord, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. That's going to have to happen. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some islands. So that's the first thing. And it is that Paul says, next slide, Paul trusts that what God says is true. Paul trusts that what God says is true. Second section, beginning in verse 27 through 32. On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, which actually could have been a sail or something like a sea anchor, and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay with the ship, you can't be saved. So the soldiers cut the rope that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. So the second lesson is, if you want to save your life here, you got to obey. You got to obey the plan. Third section, verses 33 through 38. And this is where he says, eat. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. He says, for the last 14 days, you've been in constant suspense and gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of them on board, Paul plus 275. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. So lesson 3 is they obeyed Eve even when it didn't make sense to them. Even when it didn't make sense to throw that grain into the sea. Now, Luke knows that, and he's kind of accentuating that there are a lot of similarities between Paul's life and Jesus' life. And one of those is simply this. No storm could get in the way of God achieving his purposes in their lives, okay? Right? No storm could get in the way of achieving God's purposes in Jesus' life, and no storm's going to get in the way of achieving God's purposes in Paul's life either. Now, this is a passage you may be familiar with. Jesus is crossing the Sea of Galilee. There's a storm that breaks out right away. He goes to sleep in the back of the boat. Aren't you worried about us dying in this? And he says, you have little faith. And he calms the sea, and they go, who is this guy? And the Lord of creation. Well, there is that. Yeah, okay. So it goes like this. Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us. We're going to drown. He replied, you have little faith. Why are you so afraid? Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, what kind of man is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. So no storm can get in the way of Jesus. No storm can get in the way of Paul and God's purposes in his life. And no storm can get in the way of God's purpose in your life. Do you believe that? Okay, that's right. No storm can get in the way of God's purposes in your life. Now, we all have storms. We have storms in our families. Some of us have storms that come in the form of an illness. Most of us have that at some point in our lives. We all have storms. But no storm can get in the way of God doing what he wants to do in your life. As a matter of fact, God won't waste a good storm in your life. He will use it for good purposes. So he doesn't just let storms come in, he uses them. He won't waste them. Now, many of you would know this. Some of you might not have heard, and some of you may not be in the bubble I'm in, who may not know the name Tim Keller. Many of us would know the name Tim Keller. Tim was a wonderful and unique pastor in our generation and informed and taught a lot of guys like me, and we quoted him and we used his ideas. He was just brilliant. He was a unique, one-of-a-generation kind of person. And as you may have been aware, he passed away on Friday. He passed away at the age of 72, at the age of pancreatic cancer. Now, I really like what he said about how he handled the storm of pancreatic cancer. A lot of what he said, and he said a few things. But here's what he said while he was going through that battle. He said, this is going to sound like an exaggeration. My wife and I would never want to go back to the kind of prayer life and spiritual life we had before the cancer. Never. Every so often, Kathy and I will say, we're having a much better life now. Okay? God uses his storms. But to get to that kind of a place, there's a part for you to play, a part for me to play. And it follows the 3 interventions of Paul to the sailors on the boat. Put up the first one. You have to trust that what God has said is true. You have to trust that what God has said is true. God has said he's going to work out all things together for good if you love him and have been called to him. Do you trust that promise? Because it's true. Do you trust it? Your child's in trouble, wandering. Maybe you've even lost a child. Is that promise still true for you? Is it true for them? He doesn't ask you to believe that all things are good. He asks you to believe that all things can be used for good, okay? Big difference. I want you to think about how you describe your life when you talk about it. Do you end your story with your trouble or with how God has worked in the midst of your trouble? You hear me? Do you end your story by saying, yeah, I've had some trouble, but God, but God, but God? And if you don't describe it that way, you need to change the way you tell your story. We learn in the story from Acts today that one man's trust impacted and actually saved the lives of 275 people. Whose life has been changed because of your trust in God, okay? I'm asking you that. Whose life has been changed because of your trust in God? Now that takes us to the second thing that was required of the men of that ship with Paul, and the second thing is this. They had to obey. If they left the ship, the deal was off. Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. Now, let's just be very clear here. Obedience is a dirty word these days, right? People don't like that word obedience, obey. They don't like it. And I think I know why. Because, very simply, obedience always deals with submission to an authority, right? That's what obedience is. And it seems that these days, everybody with authority seems to what? Abuse it. Everybody with authority seems to abuse that authority. Priests and pastors abuse their authority. There's always a new story about a terrible thing that's happened in a church. Politicians and government abuse their authority. I don't have to tell you any of those stories, right? Husbands sometimes abuse authority in the home, and bosses abuse authority at the office. Happens all the time. You name any figure in our culture or in the world who has authority, and there are myriad stories of them abusing that authority to hurt people. But for those of us who believe there is a God, who's the ultimate authority in the world? Who is it? God. And thank you for not saying Luke on that one. It was Luke, but that was the first half. God's the ultimate authority. Listen to me. God never abuses his authority. He only uses it for good and for his glory. It's the only way he uses it. He's unique. So, friend, don't let your disgust over how human authorities abuse it turn you off on the authority of God. His authority is unique. And the ultimate reason anybody trusts God or obeys God is because they trust him. They trust what he says is true and best. Do you trust that? Come on, honestly, many of us don't. We all don't at times. Now, people go to churches these days, and it's kind of an age of grace, right? I love grace, I need grace. And so people go to churches, and we love to hear about grace. But if you are going to church, if this isn't your church, and you go to a church that doesn't teach you to obey, you're not being taught the whole counsel of God. That is not the whole counsel of God. Take a look at these verses. John 14:15. This is Jesus. If you love me, you will obey what I command. Could you be any clearer? I mean, it couldn't be any clearer. John 14. This is kind of a promise. Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and here's the promise. And I too will love them and show myself to them. You want to see God? Obey him. You don't see God? Maybe you're not obeying him. And then my favorite verse, my life verse, 1 John 2:3-6. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but doesn't do what he commands, they're a liar. And the truth is not in that person. And this is my verse. But if anyone obeys his word, God's love is truly made complete in them. I love that. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. Can't be clearer. And the last part of what we learn from Paul is from his third intervention. Did it make a lot of sense to throw all the food off the ship? Not unless you're going to be getting off onto land. And so it is, obey even if it doesn't make sense to you. I mean, has God ever asked you to do something that doesn't make sense to you? Good, I'm glad, because if he hasn't, you probably haven't been listening. Review. Paul trusted God, and his trust inspired others, and it saved their lives. Paul obeyed and told the people around them to obey, or in their case, they would die. And Paul told them to do something that didn't make sense unless he was right about God, that he would come through. So questions for you. Are you trusting God? Are you trusting him enough that someone else's life might be inspired by you? Are you obeying God? One last rejoinder. Most people don't obey God because they misunderstand the gospel. The gospel is not this. Jesus died for your sins so you could get to heaven. The gospel is this. Jesus died so you could be back in love with God and spend forever with him. And your sin and your guilt were getting in the way of that. So Jesus paid for that so you could be back in love with God. And when you love someone, you want to do what pleases them. That's the gospel. And if that's not part of your gospel, you've taken the one that says, hey, why don't you just get a free pass on heaven? It's not the gospel. The gospel is you have a chance to be in love with God again. And he's going to take away the barrier, and then you can love him. And if you love him, you're going to want to do what he says. And then thirdly, if God asks you to make a sacrifice, are you going to say, God, you've given me everything. You've made me everything. There's simply nothing you can't ask.